welcome. Good afternoon if you're joining us from somewhere in the Indian subcontinent. If you're somewhere in Europe, I guess an early good afternoon. And if you're in the North America region, as Todd has very kindly joined us from, a very, very early good morning to you. Just a couple of quick pointers for the attendees. You are in view and listen only mode. This is probably self-evident, but there's such a dearth of platforms that we're using that I thought it might be worthwhile to mention in case you're wondering why your browser hasn't asked you to access your mic and your camera. So we cannot see you. You can see us and hear us. The way we would love for you guys to interact with us is using the chat function, which is on the right-hand side of your screen. You can use that to send messages to everybody who is in the room, as well as direct it to any one of us, especially if you have any technical challenges. Feel free to shoot me a chat message and I'll do what I can to help you out. I will speak for about 10 or 15 minutes at max. I'm not really set up to answer any questions in that the bulk of what I'm going to be saying is going to be context setting. Todd and Yash will be getting into the meatier parts of the discussion today in the context of where the Indian automobile manufacturing industry is, as well as how remanufacturing in the automotive sector fits in. So I would encourage you to stay the entire length because I think it's going to be a fascinating learning experience as well as discussion. So one or two questions after Yash and Todd speak respectively, and I'd encourage you to put those in the chat, and you can save the rest of your questions if you would. That would be terrific towards the end. You're welcome to include the questions as we go along, but we'll do our best to get to most of the questions at the end. The webinar is being recorded, so in case you do have to jump off for some reason, fear not. We will post the recording within the next week. But we very much encourage you to stay because when the recording is posted, there's no interactive Q&A. So this is really an opportunity to be part of the discussion as we're going along. So our speakers for today, I am very, very pleased to have Yashpal Sachar and Todd Whelan join us today. Yashpal Sachar serves as the chairman of the Aftermarket Parts Group at the Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers. He has been in this role for the last 5 years. He's also the general manager for corporate affairs at Honda Cars India Limited. He has over 30 years of work experience and has worked with various automobile and consumer electronics multinational companies. He has expertise in the areas of sales, supply chain of service parts, and corporate affairs. He is a mechanical engineer by training, which is great because so am I. And he has an MBA from the Faculty of Management Studies at Delhi University. So welcome, Yash. And our second speaker for today is Todd Whelan. Todd is joining us from Indiana, from the city of Columbus, which is south of Indianapolis, very early in the morning. Todd is the Director of Research and Technology for Cummins New and Recon Parts, which is the division of Cummins that specifically looks at remanufactured products. He has responsibility for developing products, processes, and technologies for remanufactured and new aftermarket parts. He leads a global team and an R&D center dedicated to aftermarket needs. Todd has been involved in remanufacturing for over 15 years now, including global reman engineering leadership, new plant startups, and new business development. He participates in making new product designs remanufacturable and in framing sustainability goals for Cummins. He is a board member of the Remanufacturing Industries Council in the US and chairs the Research and Development Committee at the Council. His career includes leadership roles in product and materials engineering, additive manufacturing, design and simulation at Cummins and elsewhere, and was a US naval officer before joining industry. So welcome, Todd.
Thank you.
All right. So I want to just very quickly run through the agenda that we have set up for the next 90 minutes. You'll only hear from me for the next 10 or so. Following that, Yash will share a perspective on or a current state snapshot of the Indian automotive industry, which has seen, like many industries, a very interesting last year. Following that, we'll hear from Todd, who will give us a sense for the remanufacturing point of view in India. Cummins has two facilities operating in India. Cummins has also been in the remanufacturing business for a number of years, so it will be a fascinating point of view to get a sense for how this works as a business model in given the operating and other circumstances that we have in India. Following that, roughly at about the hour mark at 5, we will switch into a discussion and Q&A where really you have an opportunity to pose your questions, and also we will discuss amongst ourselves anything that emerges by virtue of having learned what is shared during the presentation. So very much encourage you to stay towards the end, because this is going to be in some ways a lot of the interesting and the movement forward kind of conversation emerges when we step away from the script of presenting and just talk about ideas. My goal is to wrap up by 5:25 or 5:30 at the latest, and I will do my very best to keep us on time and on track here. So that being said, how did we get here? What I want to spend the next few minutes on is just talking about context and where we are from a very bird's eye view of the evolution of the auto industry. This particular graphic that you're seeing is derived from the strategic intelligence platform that the World Economic Forum has. And WF really identifies 6 key elements or factors that are shaping the automotive industry at large. Of these 6, business model shifts, emissions and pollution, and market divergence really I see as being the most pertinent to emerging or developing markets like India. From a business model shifts perspective, there's a broad movement from ownership to a transportation experience. Looking at shifting demographics, we're seeing that millennials have a lower rate of car ownership. And also there is a greater movement and growth of sharing economy related mobility services. From a, emissions and pollution standpoint, this is common knowledge at this point. Climate change and air pollution really are big pieces of the shifts that are happening across the board in mobility in general, not just in the auto industry. And the circular economy is part of that transition for sort of looking at it from an economic architecture perspective. How do we move towards a model that gets us to those goals of sustainability, coupled together with technology shifts, etc. And market divergence is really the fact that demand is shifting to emerging markets, India being part of that emerging. And it provided a really good framing of some of the driving forces within the auto industry. It was a study that surveyed executives in the hundreds from the auto industry as well as industry experts. And there were some key points that I thought were relevant, which are both driving factors as well as in some ways provide the clues towards the path forward. One of those being, again, related to climate change is transportation accounted for about a quarter of the world's global CO2 emissions, and road transportation alone accounted for about 18% in 2016, which is fairly substantial. Non-biodegradable waste from end-of-life usage as well as manufacturing contributes to landfills, land toxification, and water pollution. And from a life cycle standpoint, production of vehicles takes up a fair amount of resources, energy, water, resources, which when you take that and layer it across the life cycle and also look at the carbon footprint, all of that adds up to be quite substantial as well. what the report or that research also found as conclusions is that within the auto industry, sustainability is being looked at as a strategic issue, um, and almost to the point of part of organizational purpose. So it's no longer at the periphery. It is very much front and center in terms of how companies are moving forward on sustainability actions, and also how they see themselves and what that relationship means to their consumers and stakeholders at large. Not surprisingly, sustainable R&D and sustainable manufacturing, which is closer to the core of what the industry does, receives greater attention from companies. And two critical areas have been identified in terms of driving maximum sustainability impact in the industry. One is ensuring that electric vehicles are truly sustainable, and the other is incorporating circular economy practices across the value chain. And this is really where remanufacturing fits in. Look through that circular economy point of view. And I want to quickly talk about what remanufacturing is. Many of you may already be familiar with it, but as we are, part of the work that we do is sensitization about remanufacturing and also clarifying what it is and what it isn't. And I think there's some utility in reinforcing that messaging every time we have an opportunity. So from a process standpoint, when a product like an engine or something as small as a starter or a brake caliper reaches the end of its useful life, from a process standpoint, going counterclockwise on that diagram, it involves the collection or reverse logistics of that product, preferably done in a formalized kind of way to ensure that the product is cared for so that value is retained, it's not damaged, etc. Following that, it's brought back into the industrial environment or industrial loop where you have processes or steps like disassembly, inspection, and then repairing, upgrading, or replacement of parts that are no longer functional. Following that, it follows a very similar path in terms of traditional manufacturing in that you're assembling, coating, finishing, performing the requisite quality tests, and the product enters the supply chain back again, either going back to the original user, say if it might be through some kind of lease-based business model, or it can end up with a new user. And I intentionally started with the process because the process gives you some context to the definition, which is to say it's a comprehensive and industrial rigorous process. You're looking at bringing products back to a like new or better than new condition from a quality and functionality and performance perspective. And it's a controlled and reproducible and sustainable process. That's really what is defined as remanufacturing. This is from the American National Standards Institute standard that was published in early 2016. The standard is dated 2016. It was finally issued in early 2017. And in talking about remanufacturing, it's also worthwhile just talk about what it isn't. There sometimes is this danger that words that have a re before them, like recycling, reusing, repurposing, they all get lumped together. And so remanufacturing gets lumped into that. And so it's some kind of recycling activity. And this is completely not true. Remanufacturing is extremely specific in terms of what it does. There are standards associated with it, and you're looking at bringing a product back to a functional and quality level, which is as good as new, if not better. So it is not recycling, which is typically understood to be material recovery, reusing, which is essentially giving a product another life cycle without any major intervention, not that either. Certainly not repurposing, where you're looking at a different purpose or use altogether. Repairing comes close, but it's also not the same thing. Part of it is the quality that you get at the end of it, as well as the warranty that's assigned to the product. Remanufacturing sometimes is interchangeably used with refurbishing and reconditioning, not necessarily in a broad kind of way, but there are some industries that use those interchangeably. I am a bit of a purist in that I stick to remanufacturing, especially because there is that ANSI standard that puts a clear stake in the ground as to say this is what it is. And so there's clarity in sticking to that and value in that, so not to confuse what remanufacturing is with other elements of that circular economy closed loop model. From a global standpoint, These are statistics from a study that was done earlier in, I think it was 2019, and published early this year by KBC and Rematech, which surveyed participants attending a conference, a remanufacturing conference, and so this was, direct feedback from industry incumbents, and to give you a sense for what the size of the markets are in Europe and Asia Pacific really are kind of at the top. And passenger cars and heavy trucks also are the dominant sub-segments within the auto industry that where remanufacturing occurs. From the standpoint of where or which product categories remanufacturing occurs in, as well as which categories are likely to grow over time, the figure on the right clearly shows you that given the growth of electric mobility worldwide, the projection is that electronic components, ECUs, electric and hybrid drive units, batteries are really where a lot of the market is going to shift as time goes on. But that's looking at probably several years. There still will continue to be remanufacturing occurring in traditional automotive markets. And really that's where, from a transitional standpoint, in trying to hit sustainability goals, carbon goals, or carbon emission goals, remanufacturing has some real value and utility in being looked upon from that standpoint. There are benefits to remanufacturing, energy conservation being one of the most significant, especially from the standpoint of looking at, again, across the life cycle of products. Things like resmelting won't be necessary if you can keep a part that's already been formed through multiple life cycles. Same goes with raw material conservation. And I'm running through these fairly quickly because you will get to hear in a little bit more detail some of these elements from Todd. But what I'm trying to do is to give you kind of a big picture, and then the details will get filled in as Yash and Todd share their presentations as well. These are direct quotes from the Automotive Parts Remanufacturing Association. One of the pieces also is air pollution reduction, again, related to the life cycle side of things, where, going further back a few stages in the life cycle has impacts. Electric mobility is really where you're going to see localized air pollution reductions by virtue of the switch to battery-powered vehicles. From a numbers perspective, studies have shown that 50% of a starter can be recovered. Again, looking at it from a totality standpoint, in the US, that equals about 8 million gallons of crude oil being saved in steel manufacturing, over 50,000 tons of iron ore, 6,000 tons of copper and other metals. So really, there's it's worthwhile to look at simply from the standpoint of what can be mitigated and how something that already has embedded energy, labor cost built into it in a particular form and shape can be given multiple life cycles without compromising quality. Rebuilt engines can require 50% less energy and 60% of the labor required to produce new engines. From a labor standpoint, it's worth sort of considering also that while there might be labor reductions in one side of it, there can be huge job growth and employment opportunity from the standpoint of the reverse logistics that come into play, as well as the disassembly elements that come into play from the standpoint of being able to remanufacture. Remanufacturing certainly isn't a panacea, and I don't want to give you just a rosy picture. There are challenges that come or are part of it, including the technology challenges that come with shifting technology, especially in relation to electromobility. Pricing also is something that factors in significantly, especially in terms of getting economies of scale, bringing in more cores back. And so core essentially is a part or product that's reached the end of its useful life. And so in remanufacturing industry terminology, cores are those end-of-life parts or products that are then brought back into the industrial loop to be remanufactured. And in that sense, availability of cores, competition for cores, the quality of the cores that are being returned, all of these factors are challenges. And how this gets implemented in India, some of it we'll hear from Todd on how it's already being done. But from a future standpoint, these are considerations that will have to be looked at closely, especially in terms of reverse logistics and formalizing parts of that reverse logistics chain. From India, from a perspective of where things are in India, it's the 5th largest market in terms of auto sales in 2019, 7th largest manufacturer of commercial vehicles. And I'm not going to get into the details here, but this is really the part of the presentation where I pass it off to Yash, who will give us more details on what the state of the current market is. Cummins and Volvo are really the 2 companies that are known to remanufacture in India. That doesn't mean that there are more. This is based off of what we know on research that's already been conducted from a few years back. In terms of shifting tides and shifting perceptions on the future of development and economic or sustainable development and growth, there's been a lot of work that's been coming out at the federal policy level over the last couple of years, ranging from the resource efficiency and circular economy paper that was published in early 2019 to the draft national resource efficiency policy and the steel scrap recycling policy, which were both put out last year, as well as most recently the EU-India Joint Declaration on Resource Efficiency and Circular Economy, which was issued in July of this year. So there's a, these broad sort of movements are happening towards circularity and sustainability, from a macroeconomic or a macro perspective. Specific to the electric mobility side of things, there's also a lot happening. On this particular webinar, we're not going to go deep into electric mobility. Our plan is to address electric mobility as a separate topic altogether, or a separate discussion altogether, because I think that can easily take up a 90-minute conversation. So my goal really, I know I went through this fairly quickly, my goal really here was to frame this, where things are in terms of global shifts in the automotive industry, shifts in market expectations, as well as the increasing movement towards circularity and sustainability, not just in India, but across the world. So I will pause here and I will pass it on to Yash, who will give us a little bit more in terms of what's happening in India from the perspective of the Society of Indian Automobile Manufacturers, as well as his own point of view. So thank you for your attention, and Yash, it's all yours.